Everything you were told about hard work is wrong, not slightly off, not missing context, wrong at the root. The grind you've been proud of, the early mornings, the late nights, the relentless push through discomfort, isn't discipline. It's a survival response. And you built it before you were old enough to choose it, and you've been calling it a virtue. Here's what nobody building a personal brand around hustle will ever tell you. Hard work, compulsive, identity level, can't stop, won't stop hard work is what a dysregulated nervous system looks like from the outside. It looks like ambition. It looks like character. It looks like the thing that separates winners from everyone else. But underneath it, underneath the productivity and the output and the relentless forward motion, is a nervous system that learned, at some point before you were old enough to choose, that stillness wasn't safe, that rest invited consequences, that the moment you stopped moving, something would catch up with you. You didn't choose that belief. It was installed, and you've been executing it every single day, calling it work ethic. While your nervous system runs a survival program it built before you were 20 years old, here's the mechanism. 3 of them. None of them are about laziness. Mechanism 1, scarcity activation. Mechanism 2, movement as regulation. Mechanism 3, identity fusion. Mechanism 1, scarcity activation. Your nervous system learned early that resources were uncertain. Maybe it was financial, maybe it was emotional, maybe it was attention or safety or stability. The specific resource doesn't matter. What matters is that your system filed a prediction. Scarcity is possible, and built a behavioral response to that prediction. Work harder, move faster, produce more, accumulate evidence that you're doing enough, because enough was never guaranteed. That response was adaptive. In the environment where it was built, it made sense. Working harder when resources were uncertain was survival logic. The problem is that survival logic doesn't update automatically when the environment changes. You are no longer in the environment that required it, but your nervous system is still running the program, still activating the scarcity response, still driving you toward output with an urgency that has nothing to do with the actual conditions of your life right now. You're not driven, you're activated. There's a difference. Driven means the movement is chosen. Activated means the movement is automatic. An automatic movement toward output, regardless of whether that output is strategic, sustainable, or even necessary, is not ambition. It's a nervous system managing a threat it perceives but cannot locate. Mechanism 2, movement as regulation. Here's the one that will land hardest. You work because it regulates you, not because it moves you toward your goals, not because it's the most strategic use of your time, because the act of working, the busyness, the productivity, the forward motion, reduces a baseline anxiety that has nothing to do with the work itself. When you're working, you feel okay. When you stop, something uncomfortable surfaces, a formless unease, a low-grade dread, a sense that if you're not producing, you're falling behind, not in any measurable way, just behind, in a way you can feel but can't explain. So you go back to work, not because there's something urgent to do, because work is the regulation mechanism. It's the behavior your nervous system learned to use to manage internal discomfort. And here's why that's a problem beyond the obvious. A regulation mechanism disguised as ambition will always prioritize feeling productive over being effective. You will consistently choose the work that makes you feel busy over the work that actually moves the needle. You will fill your days with output that generates the feeling of progress without the substance of it, because the goal, the nervous system's goal, was never the outcome. The goal was the regulation. The work was just the vehicle. Mechanism 3, identity fusion. This is the mechanism that makes the other 2 almost impossible to see. At some point, probably when you were young enough that you don't remember the moment clearly, your output became your worth. Not as a philosophy, not as a belief you chose, as a nervous system encoding. When you produced, you were safe. You were valued. You belonged. When you didn't produce, something shifted. The temperature in the room changed. The feedback from your environment changed, and your nervous system filed it. Output equals safety. Stillness equals threat. By the time you were old enough to examine your values, the fusion was already complete. You think you value hard work. You don't. You are hard work. It's not something you do, it's something you are, and anything fused to identity at that level cannot be examined clearly, because examining it doesn't feel like questioning a habit. It feels like questioning your worth, which is exactly why you've never questioned it, which is exactly why it's still running. Now here's the part that makes this more than a diagnosis. Because diagnosis without architecture is just expensive therapy that doesn't stick. The compulsive hard work isn't the problem you need to fix. It's a signal pointing to the problem underneath. A nervous system still running a scarcity program in an environment that no longer requires it. Still using movement as a regulation mechanism instead of having the capacity to be still without threat activation. Still fused to output as identity in a way that makes strategic rest feel like moral failure. Those three conditions, running simultaneously, below the level of conscious thought, produce a very specific kind of person. Someone who works constantly and wonders why the ceiling doesn't move. Someone who is genuinely disciplined and still can't figure out why the results don't match the effort. Someone who has optimized everything except the operating system running underneath everything. That's not a character flaw. That's a calibration problem. And calibration problems require architectural solutions, not more motivation layered on top of a dysregulated system. Not more discipline applied to a nervous system already running at maximum output. Not more information consumed by a brain that's been using consumption as another regulation mechanism. Architecture. Here's what the architecture looks like. First, distinguish driven from activated. Before you can change the pattern, you have to be able to see it in real time. Not in retrospect, not in therapy. In the moment the urge to work fires, ask one question. Is this chosen or is this automatic? Am I moving towards something specific, or am I moving to manage something internal? That question creates the distance between trigger and behavior where choice lives. You cannot interrupt a pattern you cannot see, and you cannot see a pattern you've fused with your identity. The question breaks the fusion, not permanently, not dramatically, but enough to create one moment of observation. One moment is all you need to interrupt the automation. Second, build stillness tolerance deliberately. If movement is your regulation mechanism, stillness will feel like a threat until your nervous system has enough evidence that stillness doesn't result in the catastrophe it predicts. That evidence has to be generated deliberately, not through forced meditation, not through vacation that you spend working anyway. Graduated, intentional exposure to stillness at increasing duration and decreasing distraction, until your nervous system files enough non-catastrophic data to update the prediction. Not because stillness is the goal. Because a nervous system that can only regulate through movement cannot think strategically, cannot make decisions from clarity, cannot identify the highest leverage action, because it's too busy executing every action available to manage the baseline activation. The highest performers are not the ones who work the most. They're the ones whose nervous systems can tolerate the stillness required to identify what actually matters. Third, decouple output from worth at the nervous system level, not philosophically, not through affirmations, through repeated behavioral evidence that your value is not contingent on your production. This is the hardest part of the architecture because identity fusion runs deeper than belief. You can know intellectually that your worth isn't your output, and still feel the threat response when you're not producing, because the knowing is cortical. The fusion is subcortical. The decoupling happens through evidence, not insight. Rest that doesn't result in catastrophe. Stillness that doesn't result in abandonment. A day of strategic non-output that doesn't result in the predicted consequence. Each non-catastrophic data point chips away at the fusion, not dramatically, not permanently after one exposure, but accumulated, deliberately, over 30 days of structured recalibration. The fusion loosens. The work becomes chosen instead of automatic. The output becomes strategic instead of compulsive. The grind becomes a tool you pick up and put down. Instead of a survival response, you cannot stop. The person on the other side of this architecture doesn't work less. They work differently, from regulation instead of dysregulation, from strategy instead of activation, from identity stability instead of output-dependent worth. The same hours, the same effort, but aimed with a precision that compulsive hard work never allows, because compulsive hard work is scatter. Strategic hard work is a laser, and the difference between scatter and laser, at scale, over time, is the difference between working hard your entire life and wondering why the ceiling never moved, and working with the clarity of a nervous system that knows exactly what it's doing and why. You've been proud of your grind. That pride isn't wrong. The survival intelligence that built that response kept you moving when moving was what was required. But you are not in that environment anymore, and running a survival program in an environment that no longer requires survival doesn't make you disciplined. It makes you dysregulated, with excellent output. The protocol in my bio was built for this exact recalibration, not to make you work less, to make the work you do come from a nervous system that chose it, instead of a survival response that couldn't stop. Here's what happens without it. Next year, you'll work just as hard, maybe harder. The early mornings will still be there. The late nights will still be there. The relentless forward motion will still be there. And somewhere in the middle of it, in a quiet moment you don't let yourself have very often, you'll wonder why the ceiling still hasn't moved. Not because you didn't work hard enough, because the program running underneath the work was never addressed. The survival response doesn't get tired. It just keeps you moving, and moving, and moving, toward a ceiling you built before you were old enough to choose it. If this landed harder than it should have, that's not an accident. Day one of the protocol identifies exactly where the survival response is running in your work right now. The specific triggers, the specific outputs, the specific moments where activation is driving the effort instead of intention. Most people have never mapped it with that precision. They know something feels off about the grind. They've never had the mechanism named clearly enough to interrupt it. That's why the work keeps feeling like survival instead of strategy. Over 30 days, you distinguish driven from activated, build the stillness tolerance that strategic thinking requires, and decouple output from worth at the level where the fusion actually lives. Not through insight, through architectural recalibration, your nervous system has never been given. Not to make you work less, to make the work finally match what it costs you. Built specifically for the person who has already proven they can work, and needs to prove they can choose. The architecture is in my bio. It's the only place I'm giving it. Calibration.